Welcome to my Let's Play of the Crusades, a Barbarian invasion mod by Kais Britannicus. In this series, I will be playing the campaign of the Third Crusades. The difficulty setting I chose was medium. As you can see, it's already a very challenging campaign, and I like the combat to be fair. The objective is to capture Jerusalem and Cairo, which is rather superfluous, and hold 40 settlements. You're given the command of 3 crusading armies: Frederick Barbarossa, Richard Plantagenet, and Philip II. Now in my introduction video, I explained that this Let's Play won't feature live commentary, as I suck at multitasking, but I'm told that you can do a Let's Play without having live commentary. So this is the style I chose. Now the initial state of the Crusader states, as you can see here, contains the Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli, and it's heavily in debt. Thus, I think my initial policy, and I suspect for much of the rest of the game, is heavy taxation and rule by force. That is to say, a large garrison. Not exactly the kingdom of heaven espoused by the Savior now, is it? Here we find the town of St. Simeon, named after the Stylite monk of the same name. This is a vestige of a bygone era of Byzantine Christianity. Though under the rule of Latin Christians, no doubt here still dwells a population of Assyrians, Armenians, a good number of Greeks, and maybe even a few Coptic Christians.
Bring back our children, you Cyprus-splitting jerks!
Just for that, we keep your children.
Will you raise them Christian?
Coptic Christian?
No!
Now, to understand the nature of the Crusades requires more than just knowledge of its key players, like Godfrey Bouillon, Richard the Lionheart, or Sala-ad-Din. It even requires more than just understanding of preceding events, such as the capture of Jerusalem by Khalid ibn al-Walid from the Byzantines, or the Battle of Manzikert. For the Crusades isn't really a conflict between the Byzantine East and the Turks or the Egyptian Muslims, but an invasion of the Latin West. And yes, while Constantinople does play and will remain vital to much of Crusader history, to ignore the Occidental influence, that which is the cultural progeny of the long-gone Western Empire, is to miss the defining characteristic of the conflict. Now let's get back to the game a bit. Here I'm reorganizing my army, giving most of the heavy infantry to Philip, and retiring King Guy to Tyre. This reorganization and shuffling around of troops is characteristic of how this game's going to be played. Since you are the Crusader states and knights cost so much to upkeep, it's essential that I organize my troops in an efficient manner. As you may have already noticed, this isn't your typical Let's Play. I'm not even doing it live. Does all this sound weird? I think it sounds kind of weird. But what this allows me to do is to discuss Crusader history with a little more precision and attention to detail. Now, if you're not here for a history lesson, there's always the pretty pictures on screen. And if nothing else, the units look great and the battles are pretty cool. Doesn't mean I won't be talking about the game, though. This is a Let's Play after all. Now, to quote my primary, in many cases only source, a practice you might want to get used to, by the way, because I'm pretty lazy about my research. The 11th was the first of 3 great creative centuries in the Middle Ages, an era of pioneers, soldiers, and statesmen. That out of the chaos of the decentralization of power caused by the collapse of the Roman Empire and the varying influences of the multiple Christianities prior to the eventual emergence of the Roman Church was born a new civilization. 2 nebulous forces converge, on one side heralded by the likes of William the Conqueror, the Emperors Henry III and IV, Roger of Sicily, and Alfonso of Castile, and on the other, Pope Gregory VII, the Abbots of Cluny, and the Archbishop of Lanfranc. It would be these men, through the sword and through the word, who come together and forge the foundations of a society where the notion of crusade is not only possible, but inevitable. Now you may have noticed I'm not building any farms, because I simply can't afford them at the moment. But let us continue to explore the cultural and institutional background of Western Europe, of whom these men I am currently controlling are all descended. There are 2 basic settlement patterns in the medieval West, the hamlet and the village. The hamlet was primarily found in the least productive regions of the British Isles, including Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and on the continental side, in Brittany and the most mountainous regions of France. Due to its proliferation in these areas, it is possible and reasonable to conclude that the hamlet may be Celtic in origin, but given the ubiquity of barren lands and their settlement patterns, it is also reasonable to conclude that this may be a natural response to the scarcity of resources. On the rest of the continent lay villages, usually populated with houses instead of huts, with small fenced-off gardens, and usually within the vicinity of the local lord's castle or manor. Beyond the village lay the farmland, where most of the food supply comes from, and the main source of income for the feudal lord.
My
Now here's a trick I learned from watching other Let's Players, particularly Sapphire Phoenix. Watchtowers are your frontier's best friends.
Move out!
Beyond the size difference between the hamlet and the village, they are distinct in terms of farming practices. This may explain the disparity in size between them.
Move out!
The hamlet chiefly employed an infield-outfield system in which the infield, or the garden, was used to grow food constantly and was fertilized by manure. The outfield, which lay a distance away from the hut, was farmed until it lost its fertility, at which point the farmer would look for another piece of land to cultivate. The village, by contrast, used a 2 or 3 field system, in which, if 2, one field was cultivated and the second one was left fallow. And in the following year, the roles would be reversed. In the 3 field system, 2 fields would be cultivated at a time, and the third left fallow.
Unseen, unheard, seen but unseen. My eyes are yours, unseen, unheard, out of moves, sire.
So after exhausting all of my moves, I've decided at this point to follow in the footsteps of the historical Richard, which is probably why he's placed in this position at the beginning of the game, to conquer Cyprus. And thus begins my first battle. So let's go through the rundown of my typical deployment. Like any half-decent commander, I consider the terrain and I consider the enemy army when deploying, but there are patterns that emerge, and this is what I usually do for a siege, or at least a siege battle with no walls. Spears out in front. Often enemy cavalry will tend to charge out at you, and I would like to be prepared for that. In this case, I have Templar sergeants. Behind them are my heavy infantry. In this case, my English men-at-arms. As heavily armored as they are no match for a good heavy cavalry charge. And in this game, they get wrecked. Hell, even spearmen get wrecked sometimes by cavalry charges. And finally, in loose formation, are my archers. Since there's no realistic threat of being outflanked, I like to have my cavalry mobile. That said, I usually like to place them on one side, so that I can strike from that side with all the power that I have, or ride up one of the lanes and outflank them when we get to the town center. Now, the historical Richard would probably be out in front fighting with his men, but this is not real life, this is Rome Total War, and generals tend to get killed, and when generals get killed, things go bad, so I leave them in the back. Here's some close-ups of them marching. One of my favorite parts of the game is to watch them march, because the animations in Rome Total War aren't that great, but you can do a lot with the character models and mods. And Kais Britannicus is kind of a genius at character models.
Units! Guard position! Units! Units! March! Units! Charge! We're under attack!
See what I mean? A good cavalry charge in this game will shatter the enemy in no time.
Units! Double time! Units!
The inefficiencies of the farming system, though it did cause them to starve on several bad harvests, nevertheless did not hamper the spread of feudalism. And the feudal village, though meager in its amenities, served well enough to create a cohesive social and political unit out of the peasantry. Birthdays were celebrated, as well as feast days of saints, and the sacrament was administered by the local parish priest, who offered his worldly advice and what spiritual comfort he could to his flock. The church at this time was largely a conglomeration of independent institutions, most of whom were subject to their lay feudal lords that appointed them. A host of medieval legends cropped up during this period about healing wells and local saints, most of whom were never canonized by Rome. The 11th century saw the expansion of feudalism through forest clearing, marsh drainage, and the reclamation of lands east of the Elbe, lands deserted after the Viking invasions. The reclamation of these lands spread the feudal institutions into these realms and saw a weakening of the centralized monarchs of the region. Perhaps the origins of feudalism can be traced back to the defeat of the Muslims by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours, but their emergence was more of a natural organic process than the outcome of any one single event. Every catch of fish, every chicken hatched, a portion was owed to the lord who owned the land. From the development of feudal land ownership came the exercise of legal power. In theory, The lords exercised this power on behalf of the king, but the hereditary nature of property ownership gave him de facto autonomy. Very rarely was land expropriated by the crown, as the lords feared that if any in their rank could suffer this fate, all were faced with the same possibility. In England, this theory was more of a reality, as William the Conqueror's reforms led to the crown having jurisdiction over criminal courts, but in most of France and Western Germany, this power still laid with the local lords. Along with the agricultural expansions of northern and western Europe, there was a resurgence of urban life in the south, particularly in the Italian peninsula, where urban life never truly disappeared, as Rome still maintained steady contact with Constantinople. Under the protection of the Byzantine navy, Italian port cities such as Amalfi and Venice flourished through Mediterranean trade. It would be these two cities that would eventually lead the counteroffensive against the Muslims of Sardinia, Corsica, and even Tunis. This process of reorganization and the rule of the Italian towns and industries are often overlooked in the history of the First Crusade. Feudalism, though the dominant form of social and political organization in Western Europe, was by no means one entity, and even under unified regions or peoples. At the beginning of the 11th century, France was the only formally feudalist state, with a Capetian king as its head, then a group of nobles known as the Peers of France, which in turn had subservient vassals. These were the Counts of Flanders, the Duke of Normandy, the Duke of Champagne,
Pagan,
the Duke of Aquitaine, the Count of Toulouse, and the Duke of Burgundy. The Dukes of Anjou were not considered peers as they were vassals to the Capetian kings in their role as the Dukes of France. These titles remained relatively constant, though the men who bore them and the family from which they descended varied greatly with warfare and politics. Now here's an example of a charge gone bad. I mistimed it, and because of that calculation error, I completely overshot the target, and thus lost all my momentum. The feudal system was primarily a function of cooperation in both economics and war. The lords were charged with the protection and defenses of his vassals. In return, his vassal would offer his personal services, that of his retinue, or a general levy to his lord. On the economic side, a custom called relief was offered from a vassal to a lord whenever he succeeded, be it through inheritance or conquest. It was not unknown to have vassals under a single lord go to war against each other, and often their common lord would do nothing about it until things really got out of hand, as he stood to gain from this arrangement as well. In the 12th century, relief was primarily paid with money, but in the 11th, it was common practice to offer livestock, particularly horses. Sometimes, without precedence, a lord could demand payment from his vassal so long as the amount was not outrageous and for a particular enterprise. And what more worthy an enterprise could there be than the Crusades? As a form of governance, feudalism had its strengths and its weaknesses. Every level of the hierarchy could provide a modest number of heavy cavalry. The combined force of these horses were often quite formidable and key to the success of the reclamation of the era. Indeed, the Frankish knights of the 11th and 12th century would form the backbone of the Crusader armies in the east. As a form of peacekeeping, feudalism utterly failed as knights, dukes, and barons constantly fought each other over territory. It was a rare summer that went by without some sort of campaigning. The papal decrees like the Peace and Truce of God did little to curb the intra-Christian violence. The flavor of English feudalism was considerably different from its French counterpart. England was essentially still a Teutonic monarchy when Duke William of Normandy defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings in 1066. King William imported the French model of government, but kept for himself a considerable amount of power that his Capetian counterpart did not have. He insisted that every free man pledge allegiance to the crown. In contrast, if a French duke were inclined to go to war against the Capetian king, his vassals were obligated to serve him first. Under William, the English were subject to the crown first and to their local lords second, to again quote a history of the Crusades. In the famous Salisbury Oath, the free men of England swore fealty to him against all others. If a baron rose in revolt, his vassals were expected to desert him. Around the same time, two Norman knights, Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger, conquered southern Italy, wresting it after 30 years of fighting away from Muslim hands. Robert established himself as Duke of Apulia, and Roger became the Count of Sicily, vassal to his brother. They became allies with Rome and became the papal guard dogs against German imperial ambitions. The brothers were not satisfied with their chunk of southern Italy. Robert and his son Bohemond set their sights on Byzantium, and may well have succeeded if it had not been for the Byzantine alliance with the Venetians. Like William, Robert and Roger established in their lands strong centralized governments. As I digress further into the various histories of Western Europe, it occurs to me that I should probably explain the context of this current battle a little more. We are in Colossi right now. A town, like much of the rest of Cyprus, is inhabited by Byzantine Greeks, hence all the Byzantine infantry and cataphracts. Now back to the ever more tangential history of Western Europe on the eve of the First Crusade. At this point, the Salian kings of the so-called Roman Empire, Henry III and his son of the same name, embarked on an effort to expand their family's estate of Franconia and annexing Thuringia and southern Saxony. But the Saxon nobles were in no mood with the king's bullshit, and free men alike despised the intrusion of the king into their duchies. This conflict between the king and his allies in Bohemia and Moravia and the Saxon rebels with the support of the Pope will play a vital role in the formation of the First Crusade. But more on that later. To the east of the German lands lay the Slavic nations of Bohemia, Poland, and Russia. While sharing a common heritage, these people were quite distinct from one another. Bohemia and Poland could be best described as Western Slavs, holding Latin Christianity as their religion. Bohemia, though fully autonomous under the Premyslid dynasty, were technically vassals to the German emperors. The Poles, by contrast, had their own king and were considered independent of all other influences, save the Roman Church. Russia, unlike the other two, was thoroughly Byzantine in nature. Their churches were Byzantine, their government was modeled after the one in Constantinople, scholars pursued Byzantine learning, and church authority came from the Patriarch, not the Pope. Oh, this part's cool. Watch this. Yeah! Ah, there goes another one. And this is when the Byzantine cavalry wrecked my English men-at-arms. Was not happy about this. And thus concludes my arduous and yet still exceedingly brief, if you can believe that, believe me, and I left out a lot of information still, exploration of the secular institutions and histories of Western Europe on the eve of the First Crusade.
is in your grasp, and there is nothing the enemy can do but run!
Victory! Settlement captured.
So I've conquered Colossi and exterminated their population and stole a huge amount of their wealth. And yet they're not happy with me. That's okay, I'll move my army out. But since Richard's army still has quite a few movement points left, we'll conquer Limassol next.
Besieging settlement, sir. Settlement under siege, sir.
But that's enough for one episode, and enough about feudalism. Next time we'll talk about Latin Christianity and the reforms of the 11th century. Woo! That's not boring at all. See you next time. No, seriously, there'll be like priests with maces charging the battle. It'll be badass, I promise.